Welcome, players. All right, we're gonna get started. Can everybody hear me in the back? Lee, can you hear me? Are we up on the live stream? Okay. All right, thank you all for coming out to the April edition of Ember NYC. We've got a great lineup tonight, and I'm excited to see all of your happy faces. I know that if you're a New Yorker, you're relieved that it's spring, and I think it's going to be a great spring for Ember. So a few announcements from me before we get started. First, let me introduce myself. For those of you who I don't know, my name is Luke Melia. I'm the organizer of Ember NYC. We've been doing this for a while now, over 2.5 years, might be 3 or so. And it just keeps getting better and better, and I'm having more and more fun. So I'm glad that you all came out to enjoy it with me. So we're here tonight at our April 23rd meetup. Hopefully you RSVP'd on the meetup site and you've joined the meetup, so you will be alerted about future events. In addition to this monthly talk, where it's a larger group, we have a structured kind of agenda of talks. We also do a different type of event that we call project nights. And Jorge Davila, who's over here in the back, raise your hand, Jorge, is the organizer for the project nights. And those are small groups, usually about 20 people, anywhere from kind of 10 to 25, focused on a particular topic with an emphasis on hands-on coding time and a kind of openness to just have like free-form conversation and helping each other out. So the event that we're going to do this coming Monday night over at Movable Ink, which is just right here in this neighborhood, we're calling Recipe Night. And the idea is to try to codify kind of cookbook examples for common Ember problems. And these are things, and this is something that the goal is to share with the community. That has existed for a little while on the Ember.js.com site. With the Ember 2 release, we're moving it off of that site. And Ember Watch has agreed, I believe, to host a kind of new cookbook section that the stuff that we come up with on Monday night is going to be will be contributed to. So if that's something that's interesting to you, if you want to, it's a super great way to learn. There is, you should RSVP on the meetup. There's a list on the meetup of potential recipes that we're going to be tackling on Monday, so you can take a look in advance and see if there's one maybe that you want to investigate and participate in. So that's that. It looks like there's 9 spots available for that event, so definitely go ahead and RSVP if you want to come. Next month, May, you can pencil in May 28th. We are always, by the way, if you haven't figured out the pattern, the 4th Thursday of the month here at Pivotal for this meetup. So go ahead and, or you can RSVP now if you want. We'll be announcing speakers. It looks like we're going to have Tim Evans do a talk, which should be great. And we'll announce details of that. And if you have a talk that you'd like to contribute to that, definitely feel free to reach out to me. As many of you in the audience can attest to, you don't have to be the world's greatest Ember expert to give a talk here at the meetup. A lot of people have learned a ton by deciding to give a talk about a topic that they're interested in when they're just learning Ember, and they're able to speak to a lot of other people in the audience that are also just learning, and share that perspective. So don't be shy. If you've ever dreamed of giving a meetup talk, please get in touch, and I will help you and coach you all the way through it. Some community announcements. The community recently gave a bunch of input to the core team, and the core team has decided that IE8 support will be dropped in Ember 2.0. There will be long-term support for Ember 1.13, I believe it will be. And that long-term support is basically security patches for the duration of, I guess, the 2.0 branch. So if you do need to support IE8, you can hang on 1.13. But by shedding IE8 support in Ember 2.0, that's going to free us up to adopt a bunch of new features that currently we either have to polyfill or work around or not use. So that's pretty exciting. A few more announcements. Some things I wanted to share. Wicked Good Ember is coming up on June 16th. This is a regional Ember conference in Boston, hosted by the good folks at Dockyard. I noticed that a new batch of tickets have been made available today. So if you got locked out of the first batch and you're thinking about coming, check it out. This is a one-day event, and it's on an island in Boston. I didn't know there was an island in Boston, but it sounds pretty cool. I think that there is also still, I think the CFP is still open. So if you're interested possibly in contributing a talk to Wicked Good Ember, you can do that too. Wanted to mention a new podcast in the Ember world that's been great called Ember Weekend. Jonathan Jackson and friends have been putting that together. They do it, I think, every Friday or Saturday. I'm not sure, but it's a lot of fun. You should check it out. And before we get started, jump into our talks for today, and we've got kind of approximately four talks that I'm excited about. I wanted to just say thank you to our sponsors. And then after I say thank you to our sponsors, I'm going to open it up to announcements from any of you. So if you have something that you'd like to share, you can just kind of come up to the side, and then I'll hand over the mic for folks that have announcements about jobs that are either available, or maybe if you want to say that you're available, you're looking for work, that's totally cool. Other events that the community might be interested in, basically anything related. So first off, our sponsor who's hosting us here tonight, feeding us, giving us drinks from their fridge in the back is Pivotal Labs. Pivotal is a great consultancy focused on agile practices, doing work for startups to enterprises, and an awesome place to work and learn particularly if you are kind of a new or mid-level developer that wants to really get a solid foundation in agile practices, pair programming, test-driven development. The team here is pretty awesome. So it happens that my brother-in-law Micah works here, and if you would like a connection with him, more than happy to do that. So go ahead and find me. And Pivotal, incidentally, has been a host of the meetup, a sponsor of the meetup since almost the very, very beginning of this meetup 3 years ago. So we're really grateful for all their support. Movable Ink is one of our venue hosts. They're hosting our event this coming Monday night. Another startup doing really cool Ember stuff. They call themselves Agile Email. Very cool email technology, things that you didn't know that you could do with email. And Simple Reach is also an event host of ours. Any Simple Reach folks in the house tonight? I didn't see any come in. Maybe they'll be here later, or sometimes they get stuck in the elevator here. But and then finally, my company, Yap Labs, is an Ember consulting and training company here in New York. So if you have any need for that kind of thing, feel free to reach out. So with that, I want to turn over the floor to anybody here. Anybody have an announcement that they'd like to share? Come on up. I know I usually run the mic around, but I realize now that we're live streaming, they might like to see your face.
Hi, I'm Adam. I'm a developer at Decision Desk. We're currently rebuilding our college admissions platform, so we're looking for Ruby and JavaScript developers. So if anybody's interested in asking me more questions, just talk to me after it's over, and I'll also be at Ember.js this weekend if you happen to see me there. So thanks.
Cool, good stuff. Anybody else? Okay, great. So let's get our first speaker up. Hassan, you want to come up and plug in? Also, for those of you who don't know, kind of our general agenda, after the talks, we hang out here for a few minutes, but then move over for drinks at a nearby establishment. So everyone should feel free to come out and join us for that. So our next speaker is somebody that I've known in the Ember community for a long time, but let me give him a mic actually while I do this. So anyway, I've known this gentleman for a long time in the local Ember community, but I've only just recently had the chance to work side by side with him on a consulting project of ours, and it's been a lot of fun. And so I'm really, and he introduced me to this add-on that we're using on a project that we're working on together, and it's super cool. So I'm gonna let him take it away. Ladies and gentlemen, my friend Hassan.
All right. Hi. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. Okay. So my name is Hassan, and I work for a company here in New York called Monograph, and I am a senior developer. And so, yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about this add-on that I've used on a couple projects now. And I thought it was nothing special, but then Luke was all like, oh, that's pretty cool. And I'm like, oh, okay. This whole thing? Sure. Okay, so this add-on is called Ember Waypoints. And it's actually something that came from the mind of Robert Jackson, who you may know, and who is also another awesome person I had an opportunity to work with over the past year or so. What are waypoints? So waypoints, it's a library. Many of you probably have heard it, but for those that haven't, it's a library that you can use, and it's really based on how you scroll. And so the way this library works is it actually calls a function when you scroll to a particular element. And so what the Waypoints Ember add-on is just basically an add-on wrapper around it, so you can just do Ember install Ember Waypoints, and then you have all this super awesome functionality, which I am about to show you. So what does that mean when I say you have the ability to execute a function when you scroll something? Well, so from the perspective of Ember, what that actually means is that you have actions that are actually triggered when you either scroll up to a thing or down to a thing. And so the idea is you take something, right, and I represented it here in this pink box, and you basically put this add-on wrapper around it. And then you tell your this waypoint helper what action you want to fire when you're scrolling up and this particular item reaches the top, or what action you want to fire when you're scrolling down and this particular item is at the top. So what does that actually look like? So I made a handy little visual for you to understand. So if we see here, the top is where I depicted 0 pixels, and as we scroll up, as soon as that item that you have wrapped with the waypoint helper hits the top, it fires this action that you've configured to fire when you're scrolling up. Okay? And so similarly, when you are scrolling that thing down and it hits the top, it then fires the action that you've configured for it to scroll on the scroll down. Okay, so that seems pretty straightforward. What about when you have a lot of different things on the page? Well, the neat thing about waypoints is that you can actually set up waypoints for specific things that you have on your page. So in this case, I have a waypoint for my little red thing and a waypoint for the little blue thing. And so likewise, when I'm scrolling up and the blue thing hits the top, we fire the blue action. And similarly, when the red thing hits the top, we fire the red action. Seems pretty straightforward, right? So then there's a bunch of interesting options you can use with waypoints. One of the really cool ones is offset. So perhaps there is something really interesting in this particular component that appears maybe halfway down, and you want the waypoint to trigger when you're halfway down. Or maybe you want to have the waypoint trigger halfway above or 10 pixels above. And so the neat thing about this is that you can actually provide your waypoint with an offset. And the neat thing about the offset is that it's actually just a binding like any other binding. So in this case, I have a static offset, but use your imaginations. What if the offset's dynamic? You could do all sorts of really crazy stuff here. But just to give a little more better illustration of what's actually happening here. So in this case, I have a 50 pixel offset. And so what that means is that 50 pixels from the top of the thing going down is where that little happy spot, that trigger is. So as I scroll up, as soon as I hit 50 pixels from the top of that component, then my action is fired. All right, so what about when you are scrolling things inside of a scrollable div, right? And so in this particular case, we are calculating the top, not from the top of the window, but from the top of some particular div that is scrollable. So in this particular example, I have this div right here. and I have a specific ID, and I've set up this particular waypoint so that it knows the context for this waypoint is actually that div. And so in this case, when my component that I set the waypoint on hits 0 pixels of the thing that has given it context, that is when the action is fired. So that was pretty cool pictures. Let's actually see what this thing looks like in real life. So let's look at some real code. So I have an example here that I want to show you. Make sure that guys can see it. And so this is a particular application that Luke and Kris are pretty familiar with. And so the idea is that I want to have a waypoint appear. And so I'm going to start with, I'm going to first describe to you what this application, like the various landmarks for this application. So we are, can you all see that? Is that good? Okay. So we are inside what is called a work route, right? And so there's, presumably a controller for this route. There's also a few components that we're going to talk about. All right, so in this particular case, hiding right, or this header, this is that particular component. So within there, I have this div right here, license overview. The idea is that when I add a class called, I believe it is called scroll down, or yeah, no, it's not scroll down. Try and do slide down. So when I add that class, basically, what it's doing is it's actually just setting the top for that particular div, and there's a transition in there, so it kind of slides down. But the point here is that I want this such that when I scroll this by, or when I scroll this up, so that the by button is occluded, that class is added and it drops down. So that's the idea here. Okay. So let's look at code. So I'm going to reset this so you can go back to what it was before. I'll just reload it. All right. So here we have the code. Okay. So let's start at the point where we have our header. So we have our header right here in the bottom left. And so the idea is that I want to, inside this particular div, add a class called slide down. And the class I want to have add slide down is when this show overview computed property it appears to be true. And so if you look at the controller that this particular component lives in, we are binding show overview right here. See that? We are binding show overview from the controller. And so right above, this is our logic. There is an action, right? And we have two actions. One action is called hide license overview. And when that action is fired, the show overview becomes false. The other one is called show license overview. And when that action is fired, the show overview becomes true. Seems pretty simple, right? And so the magic appears just to the left here. And so this is that license card. So I have taken the liberty of setting up the waypoint. I'm just going to uncomment it here. And so in the waypoint, what I'm doing is I'm going to fire the action hide license overview. It's going to hit that controller that we just saw. I also have a context element ID. If you recall in the screen here, there is actually a title bar. So what's actually happening? There's a flex box that has 100% height. And I'm making this particular waypoint relative to the body right here, the part below the title. And yeah, and then we have an offset. And I want my offset to actually be the green, like between the top of the button and the B and the buy button. That's where that's a happy spot, right? So okay, so I'm just going to save this here. Page will reload. And I'm going to scroll up, and as soon as we hit that happy spot, boom! Magic! I didn't have to write any special code to compute it. I could scroll back up. Oh, it disappears! So the neat thing is like, all you have to do is Ember install waypoints. You wrap the waypoint around the thing that you want to have trigger when it hits the top, or whatever offset, or whatever context you give it. And then actions get fired, and you can do whatever you want with those actions. All right, so I have a couple more things that I just want to talk about. Okay, so if you guys are, if for any of the people that in here that have used waypoints before, they probably know that waypoints has a few other things. It's not just about scrolling to the top. Another thing that waypoints has, and so these things I'm going to talk about here are things that are not in the add-on, but maybe interesting things to think about, because it would be great for people to also contribute to this. So another item that is in the Waypoints library right now is sticky elements. And you've probably seen this like in Instagram, where you're scrolling down and the thing stays at the top as soon as it hits the title. Then as that thing scrolls out of view, then you see the next header, and it'll stick to the top. So that's a thing, right? And it'd be kind of cool to see that appear in the Waypoints add-on. Another thing is infinite scroll. So Waypoints, the current jQuery Waypoints, also supports infinite scroll. So that would be another neat thing to see. And also InView. So InView is another part of Waypoints where you get a function that is actually fired when a thing is in the viewport. Now that kind of segues into something that Lauren Tan from Dockyard has been tweeting about and blogging about recently. And this is the Ember in Viewport add-on. And so if any of you have been following this, she has managed to create an add-on that does 60 frames per second rendering of or calculations of things that are in view using request animation frames. It sounds really, really awesome. And I was actually talking to Rob Jackson this morning, and he was saying that he actually has plans to take the Ember Waypoints add-on, rip out the jQuery part from it, the jQuery library, and replace it with Lauren's pieces in there. So now you get Ember Waypoints rendering at 60 frames per second. That sounds pretty awesome. And so for anyone that wants to help out, we are, you can always help by submitting pull requests, submitting issues. So that's pretty much what I wanted to talk about. So thank you, folks.
Awesome. Thank you, Hassan. Questions for Hassan?
So with waypoints, does it work directly with transforms and other CSS effects that might affect the positioning of the element without affecting like the top?
My understanding is that it's just calculating. It's actually it's doing the jQuery CSS to find out what the position is or the offset is. So I'm assuming that it should work. But I don't know for sure. So it's definitely something you should check out. But hopefully it should just all work.
Have you run into any kind of gotchas with using the waypoints?
What's that?
Any kind of gotchas? Any issues? Anything that just doesn't seem obvious from the start?
I've used them on 2 projects for 2 specific things, and I haven't had a problem. I do know, there is one gotcha I know of. They are hard to acceptance test. They're pretty tricky. And so the way I do my testing for this particular thing is that in my acceptance test, I actually fire the action that I'm expecting the waypoint to fire. Getting it to scroll in the acceptance test, I've not figured that out. I've asked Rob about it, and he doesn't seem to be able to figure it out. So, I mean, if Rob can't figure it out, all hope is lost. But that's the only one I know of. But yeah.
All right, we have time for one more question if there are any.
can't think of a obvious example right now, but does it work with horizontal scrolling?
What's that?
Horizontal scrolling? Like left or
Oh,
right?
yes. So waypoints actually does have horizontal scrolling. It's one of the options that you can set in a waypoint. So I believe it's just horizontal equals true. And so the idea is that for the waypoints, we actually basically, when we wrap the waypoint, we're actually taking the options object and just passing it to the jQuery waypoints. And so when you want to figure out how this thing works, take a look at the original waypoints documentation and then just use all those particular arguments to pass into the waypoint. And we should support all of them.
Awesome. Cool. Let's give another round of applause to Hassan. Good stuff. Thank you. No, not at all. Do you want to do it now? Do you need extra? So while our next speakers are getting set up, we're going to hear from our friend Alex Machnier about something.
Hey everyone, I'm Alex. You may remember me from such core teams as Ember.js. Just kind of here to put the word out that my startup, Express Checkout, which is really just an app that lets you go into a store and scan items on your phone and pay all on your phone. We have a startup in California, and in the next few months, we're really going to need some extra help on our dev team. So if you or anyone you know likes to work on mobile Ember apps and Rails stuff, please reach out. Let me know.
Good stuff. Great opportunity to learn from a very talented developer, too. So our next speakers are my friends and colleagues, Ray and Kris. They're going to talk about a couple of open source add-ons that Yap Labs has been nurturing and growing.
How's it going? Can you hear me? Cool. All right. So this one's pretty simple. It's a Ember radio button component. I'm on Kris's laptop and he has scrolling the opposite way that I have it, so it's cool. Thanks for those options, Apple. All right, so this component just gives you a kind of a simple radio button. So you can see this. Is it big enough? Yeah. So you can see this template here. The example. There's two versions. There's one with no block and one with a block. So the one with the block has the blue content inside the block. And so probably the most interesting thing is, so the output is shown below, and the one with the block wraps everything in a label, so that when you click the label, just because your browser knows that, it'll check or uncheck the input. And then it supports most of the options you would expect a radio button to need. And you get an action called change that will fire up, and you can know that the user did something that changed your checkbox and not just your code switching values around changed your checkbox. So if your data reloads in the server, the changed wouldn't fire, but if you user clicks something, the changed will fire. So the most interesting thing about, it's a pretty simple project, the most interesting thing about the, sorry. I just wanted to switch to the code. I can use the sorry about that. Ooh. I'm in the wrong folder. Right, so the most interesting thing is the way the component switches between the block form and the non-block form is when it inits, it checks if you have a template. And if you have a template, it goes and switches like a whole bunch of things over to work the other way. So it's kind of an interesting hack that you could check out. Oh, the other tab. And just to prove that it actually works, here's the dummy app. So switching between green and blue, and it fires this color change, which gives us the alert. disabled, required. So that's it. That's pretty much it. Any questions about that?
How would you compare this to the built-in radio button in Ember?
Is there a built-in radio button? Oh, okay.
So you're saying this would be better?
I hope so. If there's a built-in radio button added to Ember, then maybe this wouldn't be better. But for now,
Cool. Also, quick shout out to Dennis, who wrote the first version of this, too. Cool. Other questions on this add-on? We were sort of joking because there is no built-in radio button component in Ember, so its existence makes it better for one thing.
It's like
and the fact that it works is a bonus.
It's like reverse trolling from Luke.
So can this support like 4 radio buttons, the radio buttons that aren't actual input elements?
So if you don't want input tags on the page, then it wouldn't make sense to use this library because it puts input tags. But if you're not, you don't have to show them. So when we use it in some of our projects, we end up actually having display none on the input tag and use our own little symbol that we have different render states for looking like it's checked or not. But you can still get the usage out of the way the browser handles input tags without showing the user that. So.
Cool. Any others on this one? All right. Thanks.
Hello, oh, this does work. All right. All right, so we wanted to talk to you about wormholes. This is going to take about 45 minutes. So last month we talked about a new add-on that we had put out. It's called Ember Modal Dialog. And it's a quick little recap. Basically, that implements modal dialogues throughout an Ember application. But those dialogues are rendered to a dedicated location in the DOM. And that's not through the magic of morphs, that's actually not the DOM location of the Ember view, but because it's being managed by the component, we were able to maintain our context in the view hierarchy and take advantage of all the goodies that gets us while still putting our modals in one spot, much like a lot of modal libraries would expect. But when we were thinking through, we were already thinking that this technique of kind of putting this thing over there might be useful in other scenarios. And so Luke took it upon himself to extract that portion of things into a separate add-on, which is Ember Wormhole. And while we were at it, we decided we had been using private APIs that had to do with the morphs themselves, and instead now when you dig into the source code, you'll see here that we are basically you're taking advantage of that same technique that's happening under the hood, but we are only using public APIs now, and we're just managing the range of DOM nodes that matters. I won't go into the source right now, but I will show you how it works in practice. So here's our dummy app. This is the modal. Actually, probably the more visually obvious example will be the sidebar. So if you were to pull down this add-on and install things and run the app locally, this is the dummy app that's contained within the Ember Wormhole project. I'm going to click this toggle sidebar content. So there's a view over here, and yet its guts are showing up over here. I'm not entirely sure of use cases. It's definitely good for parlor tricks, and this is a really good... It's a really cool name. I kind of like talking about this in semi-public locations because it sounds like, I don't know, the movie Interstellar or something like that. But the technique, I've been seeing people start to use it. I think some of the document title add-ons are going to make use of this. Titles or favicons, or we even thought maybe in a fast boot world there might be some usage for this for Open Graph meta stuff. Because we're doing stuff in Ember territory, but sticking it over in other locations of the DOM that don't have to be where the view is. So one other thing I'll show you here before giving a quick update on the modal dialog add-on itself is that we wanted And again, I'm not entirely sure of a use case here, but we wanted to be able to switch the destination element. Do you know a use case for this? Okay. So so now this is just a property of the component. So if we actually change that property, which is aliased as to or destination element ID, I believe, then you can see that the stuff is just hopping around the DOM, and it is in fact not breaking, whereas a month ago this would have broken. So let's look at Ember modal dialog really quickly. This is going to look very similar to last month, so I won't talk about it too much. But we did do some nice things. First of all, when we extracted Wormhole, the APIs for this didn't really change because of that extraction. We do have new releases, obviously, but that was kind of nice. Now, one of the things, for anyone that has played with this, we had set the alignment target of the modal. It was in certain cases when you're doing something like this and you want your modal to show up near where you are. The way that you did that was specified a CSS selector. Now, there's a few different ways you can do it. You can specify a CSS selector or an Ember view, if that's what you have in your consuming context, or an element itself. And we changed there were some problems we had with CSS handling that we made slightly nicer. So if anyone checked it out within the past few weeks, definitely pull the latest version, and it should behave more nicely. So that's Wormhole and modal dialog. Any questions?
One thing I wanted to mention that's neat, when Kris was showing the changing of the to property that made it bounce between sidebars. What's the one neat thing that's actually happening there is that there's no re-rendering happening in Ember or kind of in the DOM. That literally what's happening is that DOM element is getting grabbed and just given a new parent when the to switches, which is pretty neat. And big shout out on the Ember Wormhole stuff to Kris Selden, who we're going to hear a little later, who helped us an immense amount in moving to the public API and figuring out how that worked.
Yeah, and that code is right here.
Cool. Any questions? Once, twice. Okay, let's have a round of applause for Ray and Kris. Awesome. So what we're going to do next is a little bit out of order for us typically, but we're going to do the kind of the main talk of the night, who's the gentleman who's getting set up next. And then following that, we're going to have one more shorter talk from Kris Selden, who wanted some extra time to put together his demo. Let's see, just while our next speaker's getting set up, can I get a just quick show of hands? Is this their first time to Ember NYC? Okay, awesome, welcome. Great to have you here. Who here has an Ember app in production currently? Okay, great. And who's not using Ember at all yet, but just here because they're curious about Ember? Cool, awesome. Okay, great. Oh yeah. Right over your ear. Other way.
Hello.
Awesome. So our next speaker, I've also known for a while here in the Ember community. He's recently started doing some great writing about Ember topics, and it was through a conversation around his blogging that we started talking about doing a presentation here at Ember NYC. And I'm really excited to introduce you to my friend Ray Tiley.
Hi. Is this thing working? Can everyone hear me? All right, cool. It's really weird. I have this fear it's going to rub my beard and make really weird noises. So thanks for the introduction. I'm really happy to be here. I live up in Maine, and I drove down here with my son and my wife. They're in Jersey with my parents right now. So it's cool to be in New York City giving a talk. I'm really nervous, so just bear with me. All of you scare me. So Ember Components Deep Dive. Yeah, this should probably be called like Ember Components overview with some splashing into some fairly deep puddles. So I didn't really know how to target this, so hopefully if people are newer to Ember, they'll get a lot out of this. Those that have been riding the Ember train for a while, you might not get as much, but hopefully towards the end there's some stuff for you. So I've been using Ember for maybe like, I don't know, like 2-3 years now. Back in my day, Ember was an MVC framework, model view controller. But the model layer has always been kind of iffy. Like the model layer is really the router in Ember. It's the place where you get your data, you load your data, you get your model. But like a prescription for what your models are isn't really strongly enforced by the framework. Some people use Ember Data, some people use POJOs, some people use Ember Orbit or whatever happens to be the hot model framework of the day. And then coming up Ember 2.0, everyone's like, well, stop using views and controllers. Like you should use components instead. So if we're not really like models and we're not using views and controllers, what is Ember now, or what is Ember becoming? And so to me, what Ember is becoming is a router, really great router, still really inspires other frameworks. A lot of people are still trying to play catch up with Ember's router. Glue, so a framework is those choices that you don't have to make, right? So I pick Ember because it makes me not even think about a lot of things. It takes a bunch of micro libraries, puts them together for me, and glues them all together so I don't have to do that work. And then components. So we're building user interfaces, and on the web platform at least, user interfaces are built with elements, tags, and what Ember Components do, and what the custom element spec, which kind of inspired Ember Components and Polymer and Angular directives and React and all that stuff, is they give us those tools to build those interface elements. So to me, what Ember is a great router, a bunch of glue code, and components. So I was sitting in IRC when components were like starting to be discussed, and Tom and Yehuda started really tweeting about them and getting all excited about them. And this was, I think it was like 1.0 RC6 or something, is like when they decided to like do components and ship them and get them in before the 1.0. And my response was less than stellar. I was like, what the hell, components? Like don't you have better things to be doing right now? But as the framework has been evolving and getting towards Glimmer and 2.0, I've really started to like notice why those choices early on are really affecting the framework, and really like good and down as we move down that road. So where do components come from? So there's a custom element spec in the W3C. It's in draft right now. It's changed a lot, and I think like Ember is trying to change it even more. We have some stuff that we're doing with components, block params, which I'll talk about in a little bit, which aren't in the spec at all. The spec is actually mostly just some life cycle hooks, which we'll get into in a second, and a whole bunch about what order those hooks are called in, and that's most of the spec. So we can see that the custom element spec defines some life cycle events, so like created callback, which in Ember we have init, attached callback, which in Ember we have did insert element, detached will destroy element, and then it also has a hook for whenever attributes are updated. This is sort of coming in Glimmer, but usually like you don't really want people touching your attributes on your DOM element and that flowing back up. We really want the whole data bindings down, actions up. So really the attribute changed lifecycle hooks for custom elements is really data binding in Ember. I really like this definition of components that I got from Mixonic, who I guess got it from YCats, is that components are just like a function that has a bunch of callbacks. So the idea is you give a bunch of data to a component, and it spits out some HTML, some elements, and then you can attach callbacks, which basically handle your browser events for you. And then also some lifecycle stuff, so that like, when did I create the component, when did it get inserted into the DOM, when did it get removed from the DOM, etc. So using components is pretty simple. You can see here we have a component. We have a non-block form, so the alert message, we can give it a default action. We'll get into that a little bit more later. All the properties that you give to a component are just like kind of HTML attributes. It's a like key value pair. and those become properties on your components. A component, like a div tag, can also yield a template. And so that's what we're kind of seeing with the modal dialog example here. So we have a modal wrapper, which might provide like the overlay and the positioning so that it's in the right place. And you have like the header, the body, and the footer. And then we have an action there in a button. What's important to know about Ember Components is that when you're yielding a template like this, like so that action close modal, that's not handled by the component itself. It's you're back in your own context of wherever that template was rendered there. We'll get into that a little bit more in a second. So what is a component? It's some markup and some JavaScript. And either one of these is actually optional. You don't have to have markup. You don't have to have like JavaScript defining any behavior. You can choose one or the other. And I'm arguing that your components are really some base styles too. And there's actually a lot of work going on right now. Eric has some Ember component CSS. Pete Hunt from like the React project just actually announced something like yesterday or today, which is some crazy React styling thing, which looks kind of cool. I'm sure Eric will steal a lot of the ideas from it and put it back in his own thing. But lots of your components are going to need some base CSS. So in our app, I wrap all those together. So the most important thing that I can like try to get across in this talk, at least my most important thing, is organization of your components. That's something that I wish I did in my app a very long time ago. So I asked a bunch of people, like, how do you organize your components? And if you're using Ember CLI, definitely use the pod structure. So you get like a component folder that's named after your component, and then inside that, you put a component.js if you have any JavaScript for that component, or a template.hbs if you have some like a layout for that template for that component. And then in our apps, in that component directory is where I also put a style Sass file. And then I'm not using Eric's thing, but in our components, like we add that to our like app.sass and import it, and then that way all of our components, the JavaScript, the markup, and the styles are right there. So I've ripped this off of Dockyard. This is kind of their their like style guide for how they organize components. So what I did wrong in our app is we have a components folder. And it right now has about 90 folders in it, which is a little like, I can't get it in one sidebar in my text editor. And so it's a little bit crazy. And so what they do, and which works in Ember CLI is, I think a few versions ago, is you can actually like, put your components in namespaces. So you can like put them in your route folder. So if you have a component only ever used in a specific route, throw that component in that routes folder, and you can even go deeper than that. So if you have nested routes like an index or something like that. So I have the link here. It's linked somewhere on the internet, but check out their style guide because it's pretty good for how to organize your components. So yeah, so this is just kind of zooming in how kind of they have the blog listing component is inside the blog index folder. So it's easy to find, easy to see where it should be used, where it shouldn't be used. All right, so that's kind of what a component is. It's some style, some JavaScript. Basically, it's a template and a template/view and a controller combined together into one thing. And so going back to why I was all mad when they announced it, like what was wrong with render? Like why couldn't we just use render? It did this. You could pass it in a name and it would look up a controller if it was available. If not, it would auto-generate one, and it would look up a template. And you could just use render. So what was wrong with that? So for me, the killer feature of components is their isolation. So nice happy tree there in the distance. But so components, things have to be explicitly passed in. Your context of where you use that component is not leaked into the component. Is this thing like cutting out or something? I'm sorry. So things have to be passed into a component. On the reverse side, the data down, actions up, is actions have to be explicitly allowed out of a component. If you fire an action inside of your component and nothing is wired up to handle it, it does nothing. It just sits there. And that's awesome for when you start like moving things around, and it prevents bugs that are kind of tricky to track down sometimes. So here's kind of an example. I have some stuff in my context, and then that last line I'm calling a component. And it doesn't matter that I have a foo and a bar in my context. I'm explicitly passing the bar that's in my context into foo into the component. Same thing, you can see I'm calling like delete and save actions. It doesn't matter that those are there and available. I'll pass in the save action when I as on delete. So, and then this is what the template for that component might look like. And you can see that how I can just grab foo, it's there, it was passed into me. If I tried to put a bar in there, nothing would happen. Same thing for the actions. That save action we'll have to handle on our component class, but the cancel one, if we'd also handle on our component class, but if someone didn't pass in something, we don't have to worry about it. So this is what the class for that might look like. So you can see that foo is originally null. It's going to be clobbered by the foo when it comes in. When it's explicitly passed to the component. And you'll see why I say clobbered in a little while. And then you can see how here I'm basically catching and refiring the actions. And I might change the names of them a little bit, and we'll see how this might get better in a little bit. All right, so I didn't really think about this too much, about how I'm going to do this on the shared screen. See what happens when I do this. So I'm about to go through a bunch of examples of components from our app. So I thought I would just show the app. So this is the new version of our app. It's called Cablecast, and it basically lets you schedule a TV channel. So my company, where'd the mouse go? I have no idea. Oh, oops. Sorry about that. This is hard. All right, is that better? Ooh, you guys were getting sleepy, weren't you? Time to go to bed. So this is our app. It allows you to control a TV station. So you can see in the main menu here. It's not done yet. We showed it at a trade show last week. But it's you can see what's on air, what's coming up, and then the most complicated UI in this whole app is the schedule right here. So you can see we have some. It's really hard to use an app tilting my head like this. We have some drag and drop. We can drag things around inside here. I just let go of the mouse. So there's a advanced search builder, which is a bunch of components. We'll kind of go into how some of this works using components. So you can see this one is a category, and we can select stuff and all that kind of stuff. So that's our app. We're pretty excited about it. So we kind of redid all that in Ember CLI running on Canary, and that was what I did for the last 2 months, maybe 3 months. But before that, it was an Ember app that, like I said, before components were a thing, it was all views and controllers and stuff like that. And so how did the components isolation help me out? Well, components would have helped me fix this bug. So here we are. We have a modal that's popping up, and this is kind of the old way to do modals, where you send an action to your route, and your route renders something into an outlet somewhere. And the problem was it's a template and controller, and that fired an action, and then somewhere in the translation between versions, the thing catching that action got lost, and all of a sudden it started firing an action somewhere else in our app, and it was what is going on? And it was very subtle because of where it took you, and the QA person couldn't really understand what was happening. They just thought the whole app was refreshing. And so if we were using components here, that action would have never been allowed to leak out. We would have been A-okay. It would have been broken, but it would have been a lot easier to reason about. The other thing where isolation in components really helps us out is kind of refactoring. So here we have some we put a bunch of content in this sidebar here. Well, what if we want to put this content in a modal or something? With components, it allows us to really easily take that wrapped content and try it somewhere else, and then we just change how we're wiring the data into it. We don't have to go through that whole template and like change every reference to a variable to whatever it is in this context that we happen to be using it. And if you're just using templates that get rendered by a route, and you return something different from your model, and then you switch it to another route, and you, for whatever reason, you have to like return the data differently from your model hook there, then it can be, you have to go through that whole template to change things. And so by isolating that, all the templates and stuff in a component, you can just pass in the one variable slightly differently, and everything, it's all isolated in there. You don't have to worry about it so much. All right, so let's go through building some components. Wrapping a third-party library in a component. This is probably like what everyone starts using components for in the beginning of their experience with Ember. Is like, I have this jQuery plugin and I want to make it into a component. You know, that's how you do it in Ember. So you can see we have a basic component class here. It has a tag name. So some basic component API. Is there's properties on your class called tag name, attribute bindings, class names. Those are how you would control the element. So by setting the tag name to something different, you can get a different type of element. It doesn't have to be the div that it is by default. Attribute bindings, so you can put an array of attribute bindings in there, and then those attributes are data bound to the element that gets rendered. And then class names is, again, put whatever class names you want in there, and those get rendered on the class of your template. This is going to change soon, and it's going to be awesome. And we'll get to that in a little bit. And then when you're wrapping a third-party library, usually what you do is you take the did insert element hook, you set up your plugin, and then the will destroy element, you clean up after yourself so you don't leak a bunch of, you know, whatever that plugin did, you don't leak it all. So it's very important to if your plugin has a way to clean itself up, to do that cleanup in the will destroy element hook. That was something that I didn't really like understand when I first started using Ember, and I made a bunch of stuff, it did a bunch of stuff, and then the profile would get like horrible after a while. And then I was like, oh, I have to tear all that stuff down? Like, so that's where you do it. So like this, we're using pick-a-day. In the did insert element, we just set it up with some options, and then the will destroy element, we clean it up. So kind of zooming in on those options, how that kind of works. So like I said before, anything passed into the component gets set on the component itself. So you can just call this.get whatever those properties are. So here we have a default format, but the user can pass in their own. And so pick-a-day takes a format. So we just call this.get format, add that to the options hash. OnSelect is a callback for pick-a-day, so we can handle that callback and do whatever we want to do in Emberland when the calendar plugin says, yeah, here's a date. So one really important thing that happens in this callback, as you can see, I had to wrap everything in an Ember run. And so when you're interfacing with these third-party libraries, you do need to be aware of the Ember run loop. And so that's a whole nother talk. But basically, if you're giving a callback to something, some code to run, and it's not an Ember specific thing, you almost always have to wrap it in an Ember run so that it's part of the run loop. It will work if you don't do that. You'll just get weirdness because it's going to do an auto run, and your tests will complain about that loudly. So here in the onSelect, you can see that we're wrapping it all in an Ember run. We get the date from the picker, and then we set the value on ourselves, and that's data bound then to whatever is using that, whatever called the component. And then we're also going to send an action, and that's always a pretty good practice nowadays, especially with the data down, actions up, is to, when something happens internally in your component, try to expose that as an action so that whoever is consuming that component can then do something outside of that component. Relying on the data to flow back up is considered bad practice now. When I'm doing components that wrap libraries, a lot of those are starting to be deleted from our code base because Ember add-ons is a really great resource. There is a pick-a-day component. There's like 10 other date pickers. So Ember add-ons is a good place to find those components that you might try to wrap yourself. It's also a really good resource to scan and just look at the new components, go look at their source code and see how they built those components. People do some really awesome stuff with components, way more than I could ever possibly go through in a talk like this. And so, get yourself a nice whiskey, sit down, read some source code. You can learn a lot of things. So the new hot thing in Ember probably is data down, actions up. You know, that's a nice key. That's a nice phrase that everyone likes. You know, stability without stagnation, or you know, there's a bunch of Tom Dale thought leader quotes floating around there. This one I actually agree with because I struggle with consequences of two-way data binding way too often. As you can see, our app uses a lot of dates. It's a scheduling application. And if you've ever done data binding with dates and you realize that JavaScript totally screwed up and dates are a reference value, and so even if you have two dates that mean exactly the same thing and you strict equals compare them, you get false. And I've crashed my browser because I'm just sitting there spinning comparing dates all day long. And so I really like the pattern of data down one way, do an action when that changes, because then I don't get into that loop as much. So here's a component, really crappy example. Did not do what I wanted to. How do you open links? All right, so action checkbox. And so all this is doing, and it's going to be really hard for me to zoom in on the code. I should have just put it in. Where'd my mouse go? But you can see right here, there's a component. It's really simple. It's somewhere if I scroll. Why won't you scroll? There we go. Okay, so we have a component. It's just an input checkbox. And then in the I think it's in the click handler right here. Let's see if I can make this bigger. I'm doing some funky stuff. I'm basically stopping what the browser thinks it should be doing, and I basically just send an action. So I'm basically trying to say, like, no, don't do what you think you're supposed to be doing. Let me just, you want to change my value? Let me send an action, and then someone else will handle that. And then so if I run this, what it allows me to do is, like, handle that action and be like, do you really want to change this value? And if I do, then cool, the checkbox value changes. I change the value on the controller somewhere or the route or wherever that data is being handled. Then the data binding flows back down. And so if I decide, no, I do not want to change that value, nothing happens. And so that's a really nice pattern I found. In our app, we have an action checkbox, an action select, an action date picker. All these components that basically try to say, no, browser, don't do anything, and no Ember, don't two-way data bind, send an action up, we'll handle it somewhere else, and then the data flows back down. This can actually be tricky with certain components, especially like select components, because the browser is like doing things, then you have to like re-evaluate and basically say, like, update the DOM again to make sure it aligns with what the user did or did not do. I find it almost sometimes easier to redo these components completely. So instead of using a select and an option, I just use divs and spans and then add the appropriate like tab indexes and aria like things to make it mimic a select component. But that way I get complete control. I don't get the browser doing anything like adding checked attributes and stuff like that, and that seems to work better. So data down, actions up. It is the trend, and it's cool. You should try it when possible. This is another example from, I think I'm surprised it's not here, because isn't he at like every Ember New York City? Ember Sherpa. Oops, I'm not playing my slideshow. So he posted this on Twitter the other day. It's another example of data down, actions up. Basically, it is a formatted text field that when you change the value in the text box, it sends an action. The controller takes that value, manipulates it, formats it, sets it to a property, which will then flow back down and update the component. It's not truly only data down, actions up, because the value of your formatted date will change temporarily. It will change to whatever the user sent it to, because the input is two-way data bound, but then your action will kind of reset it back if nothing happened. All right, so another thing that we have to do a lot in our app is coordinating components. So what I mean by this is you might have a component and then some nested components, and they kind of have to work together. And this isn't always straightforward because components are completely isolated from each other. So what are some ways that we can get around this? One way is to do it with block params. So to kind of show an example real quick in our app, actually you already saw it because this is a pain in the butt to demo, but the drag and drop scheduling, right? So we have you know, an area that you can drag inside of, and then we have things that you can drag and things that you can drop. And if you've ever tried to do drag and drop using like a plugin that isn't really Ember data aware, it is, oh my gosh. And if you've ever tried to use native HTML5 drag and drop, you realize like, oh cool, I can make something sort of drag, and then I can do anything else that I want to do with that native API, so I basically have to go and re-implement it all myself. And so this is kind of something that, like, this is kind of how ours looks. So we have a drag canvas. A drag canvas is the area that is responsible, things can be dragged around in, and it's responsible for things like intersection detection. So is a thing you're dragging, is it over something else? And it's also responsible for like kind of getting the data from the things, and then kind of re-exposing them, so you can do things like calculations to do like accepts and deny and stuff like that. And so how does this work? It's using this thing in 110 that's awesome, block params. And this is like one of those departures from normal Ember components. Custom elements. Custom elements has no concept of block params. But what block params allow you to do is, you can see in our component drag canvas, we have as canvas. And what this is doing is basically passing the canvas property back into the yielded layout or template, the yielded template. And then we can set that on our other components, which allow them to get properties from this component that they otherwise don't have access to. And so to yield a block param, it's really easy. You just put yield and then whatever properties you want to yield back out. And so in this case, we're yielding the entire component back out, but you can yield selective things. So say you're building like a calendar component, you have a month component. The month component can yield weeks, and then you can iterate over that in each block. In the each block, you would call you'd have a component called week, and you would pass in the week. Then inside the week, it would yield days maybe, and then inside that you would loop over and go through all the days. And so you can expose whatever you want. In that main menu where we had all those like what's coming up next ticking down, we use that to kind of pre-process the data because it has to live update on every tick. And so we do all our filtering there in each component. And then we like kind of yield the process data back out. So it's like one way to kind of get around array controllers, and you can kind of isolate them too, is pass in some data to a component and then yield it back out in like a formatted, filtered way. So this is what our canvas component might look like. This is the draggable item. And so you can see on mouse down, it does a start drag, or on touch down, it does a start drag. And then it's going to get the canvas and send start drag. So it's going to dispatch to that canvas component that got passed back in. It's also going to do some like asserting and stuff if there's no canvas element when it gets inserted into the DOM and everything like that. I'm just kind of showing some important parts. You can see we're handling touch start and start drag. So that's another important part about components, is that they can just handle browser events for you. That's kind of one of their primary purposes. And so you can see here handling browser events. There's a whole list on the Ember documentation of all the browser events you can handle. It's good to go look at that list every once in a while, because Ember doesn't use the actual browser event. It camel cases everything. So sometimes I get really confused when like, why isn't my mouse up not working? And it's because I did all lowercase mouse up instead of mouse camel cased up. So this is our actual canvas element. So you can see the draggable item is only responsible for like kind of initiating the drag. From there, the canvas kind of takes over and tracks all the mouse events. And then when actions happen against it, like when a droppable fires a drop or dispatches a drop against it, it does some things. And then it also gets this drag data and drop data from the components that are registered against it and re-exposes them. And then because of all the components have a canvas kind of passed into them, they can just use Ember computed alias or something like that to get properties off that parent component. So that's using block params to kind of have components talk to each other. I lied when I said this is kind of how our app works because there's some limitations to it. It works really well if all your components are sort of grouped together in one area. But in our case, we actually have like an outlet, like that sidebar where you can drag stuff in from. That's just a nested route. And there might be a way to pass things into an outlet, but I'm not aware of it. So instead, what we did was we used services to kind of coordinate through those components. And this is kind of really popular now that services are around. So services got introduced in 1.10, and it's just a really awesome dependency injection pattern. So it allows kind of global-ish things to register into whatever element you need them, and then you can coordinate that way. So really, we don't expose the canvas as a yielded parameter. Instead, we just inject a coordinator, a canvas coordinator, into all the components that need it. It's a little bit more complicated this because we can have multiple draggable areas, and so they all have like a name that they register against. But basically, when items are inserted into the DOM, they take the canvas service and then they register themselves against it, and then the canvas element itself that's handling all the mouse moving and stuff, it has the service injected into it, and so it can just basically expose all the properties. So here you can see like in any element that needs access to what's happening with the drags, we just inject the drag coordinator, which is that Ember inject service, and then we just set an alias for canvas. So the canvas is the drag coordinator has a canvas registered against it. So this guy in the front row did something awesome for Ember and for me. So with the components helper. So there's times in your app where you're going to need to I don't know what component I need to register yet. And so that when I showed the search builder, where you can select a field and then it provides you with a different option based on what it was and how you're searching, that's all done using the component helper. And so what the component helper allows you to do, I was going to demo it again, but it's a pain, is it allows you to pick which component that you want to render at runtime based on a property passed into the helper. So in our app, we have a list of search fields, and they're all just it's just a JSON file that we export and then import into the components that need it. And you can see one of the properties on that is component. And so for this title field, it has a text search filter, and the placeholder is title, the display is title, and then the operators are is it equal to, not equal to. And so one thing that people might not, always do with components, but it's just JavaScript. And so if it, if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, then it's a duck. So you can pass as much stuff into a component as you want. You're not limited by what you define and what you expect to be there. So when we call this component helper, when we're building that search builder, we the first parameter, field.components, that's the field they select from the dropdown. And then the rest of the stuff is all the things that a search filter component might need. And most of them won't use it all, but all the select things have options and stuff. And so we pass all those lists of stuff in, and we pass what populates the dropdown to say what kind of search it is and all that stuff. And so that's really powerful. I wrote a blog post also where we're using the component helper. That app that I showed, I didn't really show it, but it's responsive. It all scales down. And there's places there where we actually want to switch out the component based on what viewport we're in, because we actually want to change how the app behaves at different sizes. And that, I'm not good enough at CSS to make that all work. And so what we do is we're using a component called Ember Media or something, or Ember Responsive. It exposes what breakpoint you're on as just a service. And so we pass into a component helper what breakpoint are we on and what base component we want to do. And then it looks up and then renders a component based on what size viewport we're on. All right, so I talked a little bit in the beginning about Glimmer and 2.0, and they're down the road, but if this talk was like in a week or two, it'd actually be a lot different because there's a lot of stuff that's about to land. I'm only going to go through some of it. Also, thanks for reminding me, whoever did the talk about the radio buttons. There's something that Robert just landed pretty recently called like has block, and it's basically just a property that gets part of your component, and so you can tell you probably don't have to do all that crazy testing if there's a template. There's just a property that's just exposed for you. So I would pull it up, but it would just show up on this monitor, so I'm not going to do it. But basically, there's some cool new stuff with like if you're yielding or not in a component. But I totally forgot about it and just put that slide in while I saw that talk. All right, so one of the cool things about components is their isolation. I talked about that a bit. But the isolation in a component is really one way right now. That's what I was talking about when I was saying that it clobbers that foo variable or foo property on my component. Look, I put an underscore in front of everything. It's private API. Any property you have on your component class, if someone invokes your component with that property name, it's going to clobber your internal state there. This probably isn't a huge thing in practice, but especially for like sharing and distributing components, it's really nice to be able to know like what was passed into me and what was part of my component or what did I inherit from some other component that I'm extending. And so this is basically like you can't tell. You can't tell whether the property was passed in via the component syntax or whether it was already there. And so that's going to change in Ember 2.0. I'm pretty sure most of this work is in Glimmer and is already sort of done. Some of it's definitely not, but some of it is. But basically, all the properties on your component are safe, and anything that gets passed in, that way you call like, foo equals bar, those will all be on an adders hash internally in the component. So that's the new on the road to 2.0. You're basically isolating what gets passed into your components on the adders hash versus what's already there. So it's really easy to see like what was given to me versus what I already had. This also has some kind of crossover with Ember routable components, which is also another 2.0 thing. There's a bunch in the Ember routing RFC by Edward Faulkner that's up. If you haven't read that RFC, it's really good. Go read it. But basically, you're going to get a new hook on your route called attributes, and you return a POJO from that. And when routable components become a thing, that attributes hook you return a POJO, and that POJO becomes the adders hash. It will be passed to Ember RSVP hash, so it will wait on promises and everything, just kind of like how the model hook works now. And this is the default implementation of it. So it's just the only property on the POJO by default, if you don't implement the hook yourself, is model. And so this is where like things like this make the routable components not seem that big of a deal for me. I think I might have to move some templates to my components directory or something like that, and I might have to rename ember.controller.extend to ember.component.extend. But for the most part, this is kind of how my routes and templates and controllers work already, so I'll be pretty good. But that is new and it's coming down the pike. Also with the adders, you kind of get some new lifecycle hooks. So this is in the Glimmer RFC, and you can see there's a will receive adders lifecycle hook. So this is kind of like the data insert element will destroy element. And this will get fired when your attributes are going to change, when you're going to get a new adders hash passed into you. And this is kind of important, especially for components when you're wrapping third-party libraries. Think about that pick-a-day picker we did. So that had a format, and that format had to be passed to the pick-a-day constructor. And that constructor is not data-bound to Ember. It doesn't care that the adders, a data-bound property is going to change. When you change that format, you're probably going to have to reconstruct that whole date picker. So you're going to have to destroy it and recreate it with a new value, unless it has some API for changing the format while it's already instructed. So this will allow you to basically respond to those adder changes. And if your component, usually like a jQuery plugin or something, needs to change based on what those values are, you can redo that in this lifecycle hook. Before you have to set up an observer or something like to do that, and if you do that, you owe Stefan Penner $10 to put in the observers jar, which I think I owe him maybe $1,000 now. So this is what too many of my components look like. Too many of my component classes are just the tag name, the class names, maybe some attribute bindings, but not really, and catching and refiring some actions. So that's one of the most painful, like it's not painful because it's pretty mechanic and I don't really care, but like it just seems like so pointless to have this action save, this send action save. Like it just seems like one of those things that Ember should just kind of figure out for me, make it more convenient. And so this is really addressed by two things. It's the new way actions are going to be handled in 2.0, but it's also the element and fragment RFC. So most of that, actually all of that, is eliminated by the element and fragment RFC. So if people haven't read this, it's related to routable components, also by Edward Faulkner. I hope I'm saying that right. It's an RFC up on Ember.js RFCs right now. But basically, in your component layout in that template.hbs, which that always confuses me. It's a layout, but it's called template.hbs. You'll kind of have a new top-level keyword that you should wrap all your content in. And so the element keyword defines something that creates a tag, like like a div, a span, something like that. And so you can, regular HTML handlebar syntax, you can pass a class in there, and you can put data-bound attributes right there on that element, and you can change the tag name right there on that element. So now you don't need to set those in JavaScript. So if you have a component that's mostly just a template, like you're kind of making a template that's a partial and is just kind of giving you a bunch of HTML, you don't have to create that component just to change the tag that the component is. Because there's no way to do that right now that's not through JavaScript. You have to have that class there to do that. So the element keyword will let you kind of adjust those things straight from your template. And related to that, if you're doing tagless components, if you've ever created one of those and been like tag name empty string, which is like kind of weird, it has some behaviors that you might not expect. That's becoming like a new top-level thing in Ember, and it's going to be called a fragment. And a fragment is just a component that has no tag. There's still some debate about whether it's going to have a jQuery object. So right now in a component, you have this dot, $sign function, and that will give you basically a jQuery wrapped object of whatever your element is. If you try to do that right now in a tagless element, like if you put tag name empty string, finally it's going to throw an assertion, because you don't have an element, so what are you jQuery wrapping? There's some debate about whether this should, in a fragment, return you a DOM range, so like a jQuery array of all the elements. But then someone pointed out, and it might have been someone on the core team, I can't remember, that like this would get stale. Like if you have an if block and then that takes an element out, then is that still in the array or not? Would it be expensive to maintain? Is it really even needed? So, but if you have use cases for components but without a tag, those are going to now be called fragments. This all gets combined with better action handling. So right now, action handling is kind of weird. You pass in a string, and then you have to send action. That send action looks it up and does some magic and actually like goes off and fires an action. And this is going to all get simplified. There's a great example. I was talking to Robert Jackson, who basically is Mr. Ember. So we have Mr. Router, and I think Robert should be called Mr. Ember. So is this, nope. So what this does is kind of hackily puts together what the new action stuff will look like. And it's essentially, where's my mouse? If you kind of look at the, how this is working, right up here. So you can see that you're just going to grab this .trigger thing and call the function. This is actually going to be this .adders, and you just call the function. So you don't have to send an action with a string, so you don't have to have that mapping. Also, and I haven't seen an example, but I've been told by someone in this room right now that I won't call out by name, that if you're doing that, like try and catch and refire the action, that you shouldn't have to do that. If you set it up properly and like you pass in an action and it passes down, and you can probably grab it off the adders in the action keyword. So if in my example, wherever my mouse is, so that action save is if there was an action passed in save, like you shouldn't need a component to a component class to basically catch that save and then call this send action save. Should all just work together. Don't quote me on that though, because I haven't seen an example or demo where it actually works that way. But I really hope that's what happens. All right. So, and then there's all the other road to the 2.0 stuff. There's a lot of stuff that's happening, like the mutation keyword, the mute keyword, so that components are going to be data down, actions up by default. You won't get two-way data binding when you use a keyword, a component. That's going to happen if you use the component in the angle bracket syntax. Mustache components will still maintain their current two-way data binding, and you'll have to opt into the new behavior by using angle brackets. There's more stuff on the routable components about how it affects query params. Where you define query params is finally moving back to the route where I think it belongs. And then there's a bunch of stuff that goes around this. Some of it's like really not baked anywhere yet, so I couldn't read the code and come up with a whole lot of stuff. But Eric Bryn is really impatient. And so if you go to his GitHub page, you'll find this thing called like Ember Routable Components. And it does a bunch of hacking to make Ember work like the RFC says Ember 2.0 is going to work. And so you can kind of sort of play around with routable components right now in the adders hash and stuff like that. I haven't tried it myself, but supposedly he used it when he trained a big corporation that I'm pretty sure has been named now, but I don't know. I don't know if he was trying to hide that, but so go check that out. And what other slide am I on? Yep. And then so to recap, kind of everything I talked about, probably really fast. Oh, sorry. So to kind of recap, components are Ember's vision of what custom elements should be. They mostly try to align with the spec, but they definitely deviate from it in places. They'll hopefully, it's still very early in the draft stage, so maybe some of Ember's awesomeness will influence the W3C, and everyone will benefit from all the hard work we do. They really simplified the learning curve, so you don't have to learn all these other things, views, controllers, scoping, rules, and all that stuff. Components really simplify a lot of that. Organize your components early, or else you'll get like 100 of them in a folder like I have, and the fuzzy finding will slow down Sublime Text. Favor data down, actions up. You might have to rewrite some components from scratch to really get that behavior, but hopefully it'll get better once the Ember 2.0 lands. You can coordinate between components. They're designed to be totally isolated, but you can kind of, when needed, punch holes through that isolation and get components to work really richly together. Use the component helper when you don't know what component you need to render at compile time. It's awesome. It's probably like my favorite thing that happened in Ember recently. And look out for all the sweet new features in Glimmer, which I think is supposed to hit Canary like next week, but the work list on it is huge. So I don't know if it's going to happen. And then 2.0, which should hopefully be kind of what Canary is in 8 weeks or something like that. So there's a lot of awesome stuff coming. It's going to impact components a lot, which made trying to prepare for this pretty hard. And I'm Ray Tiley on GitHub and Twitter, and that's my email. So please tweet at me everything I screwed up, and if I screwed up really bad, I'll buy you a drink later. Thanks.
Awesome. We've got time for some questions for Ray.
So you mentioned something about components being able to be nested in directories, and I remember looking that up recently, and I remember that there was a issue on on Ember CLI about that, and it said that it wasn't going to happen until Ember 2.0, that you wouldn't be able to have a component in components nested within directories within the components directory until later.
So I think I read the issue that you're talking about, and it was blocked on Handlebars 2.0. I'm pretty sure that's been merged in. Like I said, like my job next week is to reorganize our components, so we're not doing any of that. But there's definitely like people that are doing it, Dockyards. But Dockyard, I know like they have Robert, so they probably run on Canary, which is what I'm running on. So Canary is fun. You know, if you're not shipping today, try Canary out. It might already be fixed there.
Yep.
Yeah. So I know it was. You say 2.0, and I know there was a bug in either HTML bars or handlebars that was needed to be 2.0 to fix that. Because
I can also confirm that it works. One thing that might trip you up, tripped me up, is that even if you nest inside of a directory, you still need the name of the component still has to be hyphenated. Yeah. And if it's not, then it just won't find it.
Interesting tidbit is fragments will not need to be hyphenated, according to the RFC. So, but because they're not technically tags.
Other questions for Ray?
Sweet.
Cool. This was an awesome, really comprehensive survey of components. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. All right. We have one more talk in the night. Kris Selden, you ready? Let's take a quick break, and you feel free to grab another drink. We'll come back in a few minutes and wrap things up. There's been some demo troubles. So we'll at least talk. He's gonna at least talk through the concept, and may or may not be able to show working code, I should say. So it's funny that Ray, wherever you are, was talking about the system that he's building for scheduling like a TV network, because our next speaker should be an adapter here somewhere. Around here, right here you go. Plug that into there, and then. So our next speaker and I spent a really fun, I don't know, 6 or 9 months building a secondary event scheduler for a cable TV network. This was in Windows Forms way back. It was really fun, and I always, when I get to introduce this gentleman who's standing next to me, I always talk about how I've learned more about software development from working with him than kind of any other single kind of educational thing I've done in my career. So I'm going to hand the mic over. Once you mic up so you have your hands free. Just throw this over your ear. Throw that in your pocket. So our next speaker is a colleague of mine over at YAP. He's in town from Seattle. You may know him as well from such core teams as Ember. And please give a warm welcome to Kris Selden.
The main thing I was going to go over that just didn't work out was basically
That's green, right? Try that. Give me a testing one too.
testing. Okay. So a while back at a previous meetup, I demoed something that I called buffered proxy, and it's become a very popular add-on. And I don't know, I don't like it anymore. And so I was gonna show you some alternative, but I don't know, just trying to quickly code something off the cuff with Ember data. I have it working in a client app, but it's all private source, so I can't show you. I tried to make a simple demo and hit the wall. Maybe we could debug it. But the basic idea was instead of trying to proxy through the controller and buffer changes on write, is just to extend your model into a draft model, and with a few tiny adjustments to the serializer to just make sure that draft user gets turned back into user for the API.
Hey Kris, do you want to just set up the problem for everybody? If they don't know buffered proxy, what's the problem that this solves?
Save and cancel. Basically, this is just a hack to fork the record in Ember data, and I guess I'm just really bad at Ember data. The way it worked at the client was whenever they went to the basically when you went to the new route and a new one, you can just create a new model, and if you give up on it, you just destroy it because it was new and it doesn't matter what happens to it. The one thing that people kind of mess up on that one is they put the destroy on the cancel button. It actually should just be when you navigate away from the route, because somebody can hit the back button, and if you either prompt to save or you don't care and you just destroy it, but you want it to be on wheel transition and not on the cancel button. The cancel button should just go back. On the edit, what we do is push into the store, into the draft user, a copy of the data from user, and return that as the model. Then you can edit that model, and then on the save button, you actually save on that model, and it isn't till the model tells you it's okay that you then go and push the data back into user. And at any point, if it fails, you can just either show the errors in the form, or you just get rid of, just destroy, unload, actually unload. You don't actually want it to go back to the API. Just unload the record. What did it? Is my battery low? I don't know why it. It's funny how no, it seems like computers, laptops going to sleep is just something that seems very hard for computer makers to actually get right. Anyway, so when I did this for the client, it was very easy. I don't know why it was being difficult for me.
Can you show the code where you decide to save or cancel, I guess?
Well, I didn't get that far. But it would basically just be, you know, on the action for save, we would save through the draft user, and its adapter would actually go to the user API. When it came back that it was okay, I would do the store.push, this same code, but the inverse, where we push. This I was trying to kind of pare it back, and at the last 2 minutes, originally I was trying to show relationships, and that's what kind of got me into trouble. But basically the thing that led me down this route was that the client wanted to roll back relationships, and that's just something that buffer proxy is not good at. And this was, I mean, they had many different relationships, and they wanted to be able to edit them, but then cancel and have it all go back. So what happens under the hood is you push all that into the draft model, and Ember Data sees that the inverse is this new draft thing, and so it creates a new single source of truth, because it thinks of it as a new relationship between thing A and the draft thing, and creates an implicit single source of truth for those. And so when you edit the relationship there and unload it, when you've canceled, it doesn't affect the single source of truth between the real model and the relationship. And that way, basically, they had a whole form, complex form with like 5 different relationships and a rollback that wasn't working. I think the built-in Ember data rollback just tracks attribute changes and rolls them back. And I was able just to add this new model adapter and serializer and add rollback, and everything else on their form kept working except all the stuff that was supposed to roll back actually rolled back.
Cool. Do you see?
And I'll get it up and post an example on. I'll check it into repo and send a link to some working example. But basically, was it Tim Evans who commented on buffered proxy wanting an actual method on the model? See, that's another thing is that on this form they were actually using methods that they had added to the model. And when you do the buffered proxy idea, you don't get that. Whereas this is extending the model, so you have your methods. It's essentially just forking.
So you have your draft user, and then this idea is a subclass of user.
Yes.
Got it. Cool.
And they had custom adapters too, so I subclassed the adapter and changed everywhere that like Ember data wanted to default to draft whatever to back to the original thing, so that it would work right with the API and serialize it in the same format.
Cool. Questions for Kris? Who raise your hand if you have struggled with this kind of thing in an Ember app? Yep, it's definitely a problem. What do you think the so this is something that you kind of rolled by hand on a client project, and we'll kind of show an example of rolling by hand. Do you think that there's a way to what would you imagine the roadmap is for it? Does it become an add-on? Does it become like part of Ember data? Is it just stay as something you would do manually?
I hope that someday you just can fork a record in Ember data. I know he wants to add rollback to relationships, but I think it's easier cognitively to just think of it as you're forking it, and that's my personal. I don't know. So the people who raise their hands, how do you work around that it doesn't roll back a relationship?
Oh yeah, I just had a question. Does this kind of lead to a lot of sort of proliferation of code? I mean, if you have 5 models that you want to use this for on, I don't know, 10 different routes or something like that, it seems like there's just going to be a lot involved in terms of sort of you're creating copies of each of those models. Is there a way around that?
Well, you only need the copies while the form is present.
You've got to have like a serialize, your serializers and your.
Okay, generally the serializers are very minor, like you're just. And in the original thing, it was like I was overriding it in 2 places because I was only using the save. I wasn't actually using any of the other methods. I was using store push to do the copy. And I don't know. It seems
like
better than the alternatives. But that's generally for any sort of save and cancel. I think copying the data. So if you don't use Ember data, but you're using buffered proxy, there's no reason to not just copy the data, work on a copy, and when you're ready to save and you know that it actually saved, you put it back to your identity map if you are using identity map.
Any other questions?
Alex, how do you solve rollback? Do you use Ember data?
No. I don't have crazy like relationships stuff to try and solve, so my little hand-rolled thing is just fine.
So that's another thing for this client, and pretty typical of a lot of apps, is despite it having a lot of relationships, they were related to things that were just kind of read-only system stuff, and it was, you only had to fork the sort of kind of master record that you're saving. And even if you were to, and whatever you save that you want transacted and to actually roll back, it has to be one request anyway. Like, so if it was, if there were two records involved, you need it to actually be one request to the server, so it does all the updates in a single transaction, and it's either a fail or not kind of things. And there's no like simple or easy way around.
Back in the Sprout Core data store days, they had the nested store, like a fork. Basically, it's like forking a
You
store.
still have to batch it, and you have to make sure that your adapter is sending it in one. If you have to save something in 3 different API calls and one of them fails and 2 succeeds, that rollback problem is really nasty. But it's not just not something that's not to be done anyway.
Other questions for Kris, and you feel free to ask him also about any stuff unrelated to this.
Didn't EPF allow forking of records, and who worked on that from Seattle?
That was Gordon's project. He's generalized it, so it's just a JavaScript library. It does have record forking. I think Orbit also has some, though I'm not 100% sure he takes the record forking idea.
Any other questions? All right, cool. So let's give a round of applause to Kris. Thanks. We are going to head out to Crooked Knife on 14th Street. Let me plug this in, if you don't mind. We'll have a map. It's between 7th and 8th, I'm pretty sure. South side of the street. And hopefully there'll be enough space for folks. I want to thank everybody for coming out. Thank you to our speakers, to Hassan, Ray, Kris, Ray, and Kris. Wow, 2 Rays and 2 Krises. Where was the other Hassan tonight? Anyway, thank you all again for coming out. Please come out and have a drink, and we'll see you next month.